Picture a perfectly ordinary evening in an American suburb. The streetlights are casting a warm, amber glow over the freshly fallen snow. Inside, the houses are a sanctuary of modern, predictable comfort. The thermostat is set to a cozy 70 degrees. A family is gathered around the kitchen island eating dinner, the television humming softly in the background with highlights from a basketball game. It is the absolute picture of security. You do everything right. You pay your taxes. You pay your soarer utility bills on time. And in return, you are guaranteed the basic necessities of life in the wealthiest, most technologically advanced superpower on the face of the earth. You believe you are safe, until, in a fraction of a second, you aren't. The television snaps off. The lights die. The low, comforting hum of the refrigerator and the HVAC system fades into a deafening, heavy silence. At first, you think it's just a standard power blip, a minor inconvenience caused by a heavy tree branch. You light a few candles, make a joke to your kids about camping in the living room, and wait for the power company to do its job. But the hours drag on. Outside, the wind begins to howl, dropping the temperature into the single digits. Inside the house, your personal fortress rapidly turns into a concrete icebox. By the second night, the novelty is completely worn off, replaced by a primal, creeping panic. You can clearly see your own breath hanging in the freezing air of your living room. The pipes in the walls freeze and burst, flooding the hallway with icy water. You are wrapping your children in 4 layers of winter coats, piling every blanket you own on top of them, and literally tearing apart your wooden dining chairs to burn in the fireplace just to keep your family from getting frostbite. You pull out your phone, desperate for an update, desperate for an official voice to tell you that help is on the way. But the cell towers are dead. The emergency lines are ringing out into the void. You are completely, utterly, and terrifyingly alone. How does this happen? How does a nation that lands rovers on Mars, a nation that spends nearly $1 trillion a year on global defense, completely fail to keep the lights on for its own citizens during a winter storm? If you turn on the news, the media will feed you a very specific narrative. They will tell you it was an unprecedented act of nature. They will call it a once-in-a-century weather anomaly, an unpredictable black swan event that tragically overwhelmed the grid. But what if I told you that is a carefully constructed lie? What if the real reason your family was left to freeze in the dark wasn't because the system broke down, but because the system functioned exactly as it was mathematically designed to? Somewhere, hundreds of miles away in a climate-controlled corporate boardroom, a group of people were looking at a computer screen and making a calculated, highly profitable decision to leave you in the dark. This was not a natural disaster. It was a financial execution. And you are about to see exactly who pulled the trigger. While you are shivering in your dark living room, burning your children's wooden building blocks just to keep their fingers from turning blue, the truth is that the foundation for your suffering was laid decades ago. It wasn't built by a sudden storm. It was built in an air-conditioned legislative chamber by people in very expensive suits. To understand why the lights went out, you have to understand a shiny, sophisticated economic buzzword that politicians have been using to manipulate the American public since the late 1990s. Deregulation. They looked you in the eye and promised that if they stripped away strict government oversight, if they removed the pesky federal safety regulations and handed the keys to the power grid over to private, for-profit corporations, the free market would work its magic. They promised competition. They promised lower monthly bills. They promised unprecedented reliability. It sounded like the ultimate win for the middle-class consumer, but it was a Trojan horse. It was a brilliantly disguised mechanism to privatize the profits and socialize the deadly risks. In places like Texas, energy executives actively lobbied to create a completely independent, isolated power grid. Why? To intentionally dodge federal oversight. By physically disconnecting from the national grid, they didn't have to follow federal weatherization standards. But it also meant that when the ice storm hit and their local power plants began to violently fail, they couldn't borrow emergency electricity from neighboring states. They had trapped millions of citizens on a literal energy island, completely cut off from the rest of the country. Here is the detail that should make your blood boil. 10 years before this catastrophic winter storm, federal regulators published a massive report explicitly warning these exact energy companies that their infrastructure was critically vulnerable to extreme cold. The government told them, in no uncertain terms, to winterize their natural gas pipelines, their coal plants, and their wind turbines. Winterization is not experimental technology. It is basic fundamental insulation and heating equipment that is routinely used to keep the lights on in places like Canada, Alaska, and Scandinavia. So, why didn't the American corporations do it? Because in a deregulated, hyper-capitalist matrix, maintaining public infrastructure is viewed as a liability. Spending billions of dollars to insulate pipes for a severe storm that might only happen once every decade is considered a waste of capital. It directly eats into the quarterly profit margins. If a CEO spends $1 billion fortifying a grid to protect your family, the company's profit drops, the stock price dips, and the Wall Street shareholders demand his immediate resignation. But if that same CEO ignores the safety warnings, crosses his fingers, and instead uses that $1 billion to fund massive stock buybacks and multi-million-dollar executive bonuses, Wall Street applauds him as a financial visionary. They didn't just forget to upgrade the system. They actively, intentionally chose not to. They performed a cold, calculated mathematical risk assessment and decided that it was simply cheaper to let the grid collapse and let people freeze in their homes than to dip into their profit margins to prevent it. And the most sickening part of this entire tragedy, when the grid finally did collapse, these corporations didn't lose a single dime. In fact, they used the emergency to trigger the second, far more devious phase of their business model. They were about to turn your desperate need for survival into the greatest financial heist of the decade. As the grid collapsed and millions of Americans were plunged into a literal dark age, the energy companies didn't panic. They didn't scramble to fix the fundamental flaws in their infrastructure. Instead, they watched the digital dashboard as the laws of supply and demand created the perfect financial storm. Because in a deregulated market, electricity isn't treated as a basic public utility or a human right. It is a highly volatile, highly profitable commodity traded on a digital exchange, exactly like a stock or a barrel of oil. Welcome to the devastating reality of surge pricing. The concept is simple. When demand is low, electricity is cheap. But when demand skyrockets, say, during a historic, life-threatening winter storm when millions of people are desperately trying to power their heaters so they don't freeze to death in their sleep, the price of electricity naturally goes up. But it didn't just go up by a few cents. because these corporations had intentionally failed to winterize their power plants. The supply of electricity plummeted at the exact millisecond that public demand reached its absolute peak. By the rules of the deregulated market they helped write, the wholesale price of electricity was allowed to surge by an incomprehensible 10,000%. And here's the brutal kicker. Those astronomical wholesale costs were legally passed directly onto the consumer. They were passed on to families who had absolutely no idea they had been placed on variable rate plans, a detail buried deep in the fine print of their service agreements. Let's go back to the Miller family. After 4 agonizing days of burning their own furniture, sleeping in sub-zero temperatures, and surviving on melted snow, the lights finally flicker back on. The heater kicks in. A week later, an email notification chimes on Mr. Miller's phone. It's an auto draft receipt from his power company for a normal winter month. His electric bill is usually around $150. He opens the email, his eyes scanning the screen, and he sees a charge for $12,500. $12,500 for 4 days of intermittent, barely functional electricity. In the span of 96 hours, a faceless corporation wiped out the Millers' entire emergency savings account, drained their children's college fund, and pushed them to the absolute brink of financial ruin. The energy cartel didn't just abandon you to the cold. They held your literal survival hostage and charged you a premium for the ransom. While families were taking out second mortgages just to pay their utility bills, the energy executives and the natural gas traders were cashing in on the single most profitable week in the history of their industry. They weaponized the weather. They turned your desperation, your shivering children, and your profound fear into a record-breaking quarterly dividend. But as the middle class was being financially slaughtered, you might ask, where were the people elected to protect them? Where were the politicians, the regulators, the leaders who swore an oath to defend the public? The answer to that question is where the final illusion of the American system shatters completely. Because while you were boiling snow, they were packing their bags. While the Millers were staring at a 5-figure ransom note from their power company, a terrifying question echoed across millions of freezing households. Where's the cavalry? You are taught from a very young age that in times of unprecedented, life-threatening crisis, the leaders you elected will step up. You believe they will activate emergency protocols, mobilize resources, and stand shoulder to shoulder with their communities. But the winter storm shattered that fundamental American illusion with breathtaking cruelty. As millions of citizens boiled dirty snow on gas stoves just to have safe drinking water, as local emergency rooms overflowed with families suffering from severe carbon monoxide poisoning because they desperately tried to heat their living rooms with outdoor barbecue grills. The architects of this disaster were quietly slipping out the back door. These are the exact same politicians who took millions of dollars in campaign contributions from the energy cartels. These are the leaders who enthusiastically signed the deregulation bills, actively stripped away the safety mandates, and promised you that the free market would keep your family safe. Picture the ultimate, unforgivable insult. While your water pipes are bursting and your children are shivering under a pile of damp coats, the officials who voted to isolate your power grid are being photographed at an international airport. They are rolling luxury suitcases through a perfectly heated terminal, boarding a first-class flight to a sun-drenched, tropical resort in the Caribbean. They are literally fleeing the exact disaster they engineered, leaving their constituents to freeze in the dark. And what happens when you try to use the bureaucratic safety net they left behind? You call the state emergency hotlines. You call the utility regulators. You call the local government relief offices. You are met with a pre-recorded, automated voice. We are currently experiencing higher than normal call volumes. Please stay on the line. It is a bureaucratic dial tone. The safety net you have paid into with your hard-earned tax dollars your entire working life is not just broken. It is completely empty. No one is coming to save you. This is the most chilling realization of the entire catastrophe. The leaders are not incompetent. They are simply indifferent. They do not experience the consequences of the laws they pass, because their wealth and their status permanently insulate them from the reality of your existence. When the grid fails, their gated communities have massive, commercial-grade backup generators. When the municipal water lines freeze, they drink imported spring water. When the cold becomes too much of a nuisance, they simply buy a ticket to a different latitude. The American system is not broken. It is functioning flawlessly. It is operating exactly as it was designed to operate, extracting maximum wealth from the working class while providing absolute, untouchable immunity to the ruling class. The outrage burns hot, but eventually, the fierce anger gives way to something much heavier. Because when the wind finally stops howling and the ice begins to slowly melt, the true, irreversible cost of this abandonment comes to light. It is measured in the quiet, devastating silence of the homes that will never be warm again. When the screaming wind finally dies down and the burning outrage exhausts itself, what remains is not a loud political debate. What remains is a heavy, suffocating, freezing silence. To truly understand the irreversible cost of a deregulated grid, you have to look away from the plunging stock market tickers and the empty podiums in the state capitol. You have to look inside a modest, single-story brick house on a quiet suburban street. Inside that house is Arthur. He is 72 years old, a retired mechanic who worked grueling 50-hour weeks for 4 decades. He paid his taxes, followed the laws, and asked the world for nothing more than a peaceful retirement with his wife, Helen. But Helen is frail. Her lungs are weak, and she relies entirely on an electric oxygen concentrator to breathe. When the power was abruptly cut without warning, Arthur wasn't thinking about corporate profit margins or political betrayals. He was staring at the small, glowing battery indicator on Helen's life-saving machine. He did everything a desperate husband could do. He wrapped her in every heavy quilt and winter coat they owned. He dragged their mattress into the center of the living room, tried to huddle together to generate enough body heat to fight off the frost that was literally creeping up the interior drywall. He watched, helpless, as ice crystals began to form on the glass frames of their family photos, sitting on the mantel. The cold inside a dead house doesn't just surround you, it hunts you. It seeps through the floorboards, chilling the blood in your veins, turning the very air in the room into razor blades in your throat. For the first 24 hours, the only sound in their pitch-black living room was a rhythmic, desperate beeping of the oxygen machine's backup battery. Beep, beep, beep. He sat on the edge of the mattress, holding his wife's freezing hands in the dark, rubbing her fingers and whispering that the power company would fix it soon. But the hours turned into agonizing days. And then, at 3:17 a.m. on the third night, the beeping finally stopped. The machine let out a pathetic mechanical sigh, and its small green light faded to black. Then there was nothing, Just a deafening, horrific silence, a completely abandoned home. Arthur couldn't call an ambulance because the cell towers were frozen and the lines were dead. He couldn't drive her to a hospital because the neighborhood roads were sheets of solid, treacherous ice. A proud man who had spent his entire life fixing things was reduced to sitting in the pitch black, completely paralyzed. He was forced to watch the person he loved most in the world slowly slip away, simply because a faceless corporation decided that winterizing a power plant was too expensive for their quarterly budget. As you pull the camera back from Arthur's freezing living room, up above his snow-covered roof, and look out over the sprawling American landscape, you see a horrifying tableau. Entire cities, once glowing, vibrant monuments of human progress, are plunged into an eerie, suffocating darkness. Millions of homes stand silently in the ice, resembling a vast, frozen graveyard of modern civilization. When the ice finally begins to thaw and the authorities start counting the bodies, the official reports use sanitized clinical language. The state will list the causes of death as exposure or hypothermia. The people who perished during those dark days did not just quietly freeze. They died desperately fighting to survive a man-made apocalypse. In the absolute absence of a functioning government or a reliable utility grid, ordinary citizens were pushed to unthinkable, prehistoric extremes. Driven by the primal instinct to keep their children alive, fathers dragged outdoor barbecue grills into enclosed living rooms. Mothers turned on gas ovens and left the doors wide open. Families huddled inside their enclosed garages, leaving their car engines running just to use the vehicle's heater for a few precious hours of relief. And in doing so, they unknowingly invited in a silent, invisible killer, carbon monoxide. Across the state, the few emergency rooms that managed to keep their backup generators running were suddenly overwhelmed. They were not treating traditional storm injuries. They were treating mass asphyxiation. Entire families, parents, children, and pets, went to sleep huddled together under piles of blankets and simply never woke up. Their living rooms became airtight tombs. And for those who did miraculously survive the freeze, the nightmare merely mutated. When the temperature finally crept above freezing, the deafening silence of the storm was replaced by the devastating sound of rushing water. Hundreds of thousands of frozen pipes burst simultaneously inside the walls. Ceilings collapsed, living rooms flooded, and irreplaceable family heirlooms were destroyed. The grid failure didn't just steal their warmth for a week. It fundamentally destroyed the only sanctuary they had left. This is the haunting anthem of our modern collapse. We walk around with supercomputers in our pockets. We develop artificial intelligence. We map the human genome. And we boast about being the absolute pinnacle of human evolution. Yet, this disaster exposed a terrifying, undeniable truth. All of our modern comforts are entirely dependent on a fragile, decaying web of wires run by corporations that view our lives as expendable line items on a spreadsheet. We are not invincible. The most advanced society in human history is exactly one flip switch away from the Stone Age. But from the depths of this profound vulnerability, something unexpected began to happen in the dark. When the system completely and utterly abandons you, you eventually realize that the cavalry isn't coming. The only people coming to the rescue are yourselves. When the screen goes black and the thermostat drops to zero, the final, lingering illusion of the American social contract completely evaporates. You sit in the freezing dark, listening to wind, waiting for the press conferences the emergency broadcasts, or the National Guard trucks to come rolling down your icy street. But as the excruciating hours bleed into days, a cold, bitter awakening washes over the entire population. There is no master plan. The politicians will merely argue on cable television from their heated studios, pointing fingers across the partisan aisle to score cheap political points. The utility corporations will issue hollow, legally vetted apologies drafted by expensive public relations firms. The federal emergency agencies will be tied up in miles of bureaucratic red tape, requiring you to fill out digital relief forms online while you don't even have the electricity to charge your dying phone. No one is coming to save you. You are entirely on your own. But right at the absolute lowest point of human desperation, when the artificial profit-driven grid that connects our homes completely fails, something remarkable happens. An older, much deeper grid begins to activate. It is the human grid. It is the primal, unbreakable network of community survival that existed long before the first power line was ever strung across this continent. Down the street from Arthur's dark, freezing house, a young man takes a heavy crowbar to the solid sheet of ice sealing his garage door. He pulls out a portable gas generator, loads it onto a plastic winter sled, and drags it through waist-deep snow to power the critical medical equipment at a local nursing home. Across town, a woman who runs a small neighborhood restaurant sets up heavy-duty propane burners in the middle of a snowy intersection. She starts cooking hundreds of hot meals, handing them out for free to shivering strangers. Neighbors who had lived next to each other for a decade, without ever speaking more than a polite greeting, are suddenly breaking down wooden fences to share firewood. They are pooling their dwindling supplies of bottled water and baby formula. They are carrying elderly veterans down pitch-black apartment stairwells. When the state completely and utterly collapsed, the people did not. They stopped waiting to be rescued and became the rescue party themselves. This is the bitter, incredibly empowering truth that the corporate cartels and the political elite are terrified you will realize. You do not actually need them. They need you to stay isolated, dependent, and compliant. The storm forced millions of Americans to violently shed their learned helplessness. It forced them to transition from passive consumers to sovereign citizens taking absolute ownership of their own survival. And once that psychological chain is broken, it can never, ever be repaired. You start to look at the world differently. You stop asking how to fix a rigged system, and you start looking for the exit door. Once you see the strings controlling the puppets, you can never unsee them. The winter storm of 2026 wasn't just a catastrophic weather event. It was the ultimate catalyst for a quiet, unstoppable revolution. Millions of Americans looked at their frozen living rooms, their exorbitant utility bills, and their absent politicians, and they made a radical, life-altering decision. They decided to stop outsourcing their fundamental survival to a corporate monopoly. They began to engineer their own permanent escape from the matrix. The solution to a rigged game isn't to beg the dealer for a fairer deck of cards. The solution is to render the casino completely obsolete in your own life. Welcome to the era of anti-fragile living. Resilience simply means you can withstand a severe shock. Being anti-fragile means you actually grow stronger, more independent, and more secure when the centralized systems around you inevitably collapse. This rebellion doesn't start with a loud political protest. It starts in the physical infrastructure of your own home. A rapidly growing movement of ordinary families are quietly, methodically divesting from the national grid. They are installing high-capacity solar arrays on their roofs, not just to lower their carbon footprint, but to secure their absolute sovereignty. They are mounting massive lithium-ion battery walls in their garages. They are drilling private water wells, burying high-capacity propane tanks, and installing heavy ironwood burning stoves. They are building highly personalized, decentralized microgrids. When the next historic winter storm hits and the regional power plants fail again, their houses will be the only ones glowing warmly in the night. Their heaters will run smoothly. Their food will not spoil. They have effectively become their own private utility companies, permanently severing the financial umbilical cord that tied them to the corporate energy cartel. But true, unshakable independence requires more than just backup power. The ultimate loophole in this modern matrix is untethering your livelihood from a single, decaying geographic location. If your local municipality taxes you into oblivion while actively failing to plow your roads or protect your property, why are you continuing to pay the premium subscription fee to live there? The architect of this escape route are leveraging remote work, digital entrepreneurship, and specialized freelance skills to completely decouple their income from their physical location. They are taking their tax dollars, their businesses, and their talent to regions that actually respect their autonomy and provide a functional, honest social contract. They are actively trading the fragile illusion of corporate security for the undeniable reality of radical self-reliance. You cannot control the downward trajectory of a mismanaged empire. You cannot force a corrupt politician to suddenly care about your family's well-being, but you have the absolute, undeniable power to decide whether your life is built on their crumbling foundation. The exit door is wide open. The blueprint is available, and the people choosing to walk through it are never, ever looking back. The blizzard of 2026 has long since melted away, and the corporate news cycle has aggressively moved on to the next manufactured outrage. The politicians are safely back in their climate-controlled offices. The energy executives are quietly cashing their multi-million-dollar bonus checks, and the millions of citizens who froze in the dark are back on the daily treadmill. But you and I both know the terrifying, undeniable truth. That historic winter storm was not a rare, once-in-a-lifetime anomaly. It was a dress rehearsal. The American infrastructure is a decaying, neglected relic, a crumbling facade held together by political duct tape and insatiable corporate greed. The machine is not going to magically fix itself, because the machine is operating exactly as it was mathematically designed to. It is designed to extract your wealth, exhaust your energy, and abandon you the moment you become a financial liability. So, you are left standing at the single most important crossroads of your entire life. You have to look in a mirror and ask yourself a fundamentally uncomfortable, life-altering question. Are you going to continue paying a premium subscription fee to remain a hostage in your own country? Are you going to keep trading the absolute best years of your life to prop up a corporate oligarchy that would literally let you freeze to death just to save a fraction of percent on their quarterly earnings report? Or are you finally ready to stop playing a game that was rigged against you from birth? The power to completely disconnect, the power to build your own resilient microgrid, to secure your financial sovereignty, and to reclaim your absolute freedom is entirely in your hands. You do not need their legislation, and you certainly do not need their permission to walk away. You just need the courage to realize that the prison door has been unlocked this entire time. The empire is quietly emptying out. The true builders, the innovators, and the sovereign thinkers of tomorrow are already constructing their own lifeboats. The storm of 2026 wasn't just made of ice and snow. It was a brutal storm of realization. Welcome to Coffee Break Conversations channel. If this story shattered the illusion of safety, hit the subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me, what is your exit plan? Let's build a powerful community of sovereign citizens who refuse to go back to sleep. I will see you in the next conversation.